The air in my father's living room tasted of lilies and stale upholstery, a thick, cloying scent that seemed to trap the heat against the floorboards. It was the kind of silence that wasn't actually silent. It was filled with the rhythmic clicking of the ceiling fan and the muffled transit of cars 2 blocks over. I sat on the edge of the mahogany armchair, my spine straight, watching the way the afternoon light caught the dust motes dancing over the casket. I felt remarkably still. It wasn't the numbness people talk about in movies, the hazy, blurred-edge grief that makes you forget where you put your keys. It was the opposite. My focus was surgical. I noticed the fraying thread on the rug, the slight tremor in my brother Rowan's hands as he gripped his prayer book, and the way Tessa's thumb never stopped moving against the screen of her phone. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. Tessa was sitting next to me, her presence a sharp contrast to the muted tones of the room. She wore a dress that was just a shade too fashionable for a wake, a sleek charcoal number that whispered of cocktail hours rather than morning. She hadn't looked at the casket once. Her world was 6 inches wide and made of glass and aluminum. "It's a lot, isn't it?" she whispered, though her voice didn't have the downward inflection of a secret. It carried. I didn't turn my head. "It's exactly what he wanted. Simple." "Simple is one word for it," she said. She let out a breath that was halfway to a sigh, a soft, performative sound of exhaustion. "I just find the whole ritual so archaic. All this energy spent on a vessel that isn't occupied anymore. It's a fascinating study in collective denial." Rowan looked up then. "My brother is a man built on a foundation of steady rituals. As a school counselor, he deals in the currency of patience. But his face was currently a map of strained composure. He loved our father with a literal, uncomplicated devotion." "Tessa," Rowan said, his voice low and cautious. "Maybe this isn't the time for a sociological critique." "I'm just observing, Rowan." "Don't be so sensitive," she replied, finally looking up from her phone, though only to offer him a thin, patronizing smile. "Finn knows I process things through logic. Right, Finn?" She reached over and patted my hand. Her skin was cool, lacking the warmth of genuine contact. I looked down at her fingers. I thought about the messages I'd sent her 3 nights ago, in the dark, when the weight of the arrangements felt like a physical pressure on my chest. I had written to her about the fear of forgetting the sound of his laughter, about the strange, hollow ache of seeing his reading glasses on the nightstand. I had been vulnerable in a way I usually found distasteful. I had handed her those pieces of myself because I thought that was what a partner was for, a container for the things you couldn't carry alone. "Logic is fine," I said. My voice was even, professional. "But context matters. You're in a room full of people who don't care about the sociology of the moment." Tessa chuckled, a dry, melodic sound that felt like a razor blade sliding through silk. "That's the problem with this town. No one wants to look at the truth because the truth is uncomfortable. Like those texts you sent me, Finn? Remember? The ones about how you felt like a ghost wandering a house of shadows?" She said the words with a slight tilt of her head, her tone mocking the earnestness of the sentiment. Rowan froze. The 2 cousins in the corner, who had been whispering about estate logistics, went quiet. The room seemed to shrink. "I remember," I said. I felt a click in the back of my brain, a mechanical alignment. "It was so poetic," she continued, turning her phone so the screen caught the light. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the room, gauging the impact. "I actually told my followers about it this morning. Not your name, obviously, at least not yet, but the idea of the performative mourner. It's such a resonant trope. People are eating it up. They love the idea that even in our most private moments, we're just reciting lines we learned from old novels." Rowan stood up. He didn't move toward her, but his stature seemed to fill the space. "Tessa, those were private. Finn was grieving. He is grieving." "He's fine, Rowan. Look at him." She waved a hand toward me as if I were a piece of furniture she was considering reupholstering. "Finn is the most stable person I know. He doesn't have feelings in the way you do. He has calculations. He's probably already figured out the tax implications of the inheritance." She looked back at her screen, her thumbs resuming their frantic dance. "Anyway, I quoted that bit about the glasses. It got 4,000 likes in 20 minutes. People find the imagery of the discarded lenses very moving. It's good content, Finn. You should be happy your internal monologue is finally useful for something." I looked at Rowan. His eyes were wide, searching mine for a spark of anger, a shout, a defense. He wanted me to break the furniture. He wanted me to reclaim the sanctity of the room. But as I sat there, I realized that anger was a luxury I couldn't afford. Anger was a reaction, and reactions were what she fed on. She wanted a scene. She wanted a story about a grieving man losing his mind so she could document the fallout. "I see," I said. "That was all?" I didn't move. I didn't pull my hand away, though I felt the urge to scrub my skin where she had touched it. I simply sat and watched her. I watched the way her eyes darted across the screen, the way she checked her notifications with a Pavlovian hunger. She was a scavenger. She didn't create, she harvested. The wait continued for another hour. People shuffled in and out, offering the usual platitudes. Tessa stayed by my side, a perfect, supportive partner to any outside observer. She whispered small comments about the floral arrangements being tacky and the carpet needing a steam clean. She was testing the perimeter, seeing how much more she could take before I pushed back. She didn't realize that I had stopped pushing. I was simply observing the architecture of her betrayal. When the last of the guests had filtered out, leaving only the family and the heavy scent of the flowers, I stood up. My legs felt heavy but stable. "I'm going to go clear my head," I said to Rowan. "Do you want me to come with you?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. He looked at Tessa with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning dislike. "No, stay here. Help the director with the final timings." Tessa stood up, smoothing her dress. "I'll come. I need to get some better light for a follow-up post anyway. The sunset against the porch might work for the closure arc." "No," I said, looking her directly in the eye for the first time since she had quoted my private thoughts to a room full of strangers. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let a single vibration of emotion escape. "I need to be alone, Tessa. Go home. I'll see you later." She blinked, surprised by the finality of it. "Finn, don't be dramatic. I'm trying to help you process this." "I've processed it," I said. "Entirely." I walked out the front door before she could respond. The evening air was cooler, a relief against the stagnant atmosphere of the house. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, not turning the key. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a notification from a social media platform I rarely checked. I had set an alert for her handle months ago, a habit from the early days of our relationship when I thought her ambition was charming. I opened the app. There it was, a photo of the casket, filtered to look moody and artistic, taken from over my shoulder while I wasn't looking. The caption was a long, rambling essay about the emotional sterility of the modern male, and how some people use grief as a shield to hide their lack of depth. She had used my words, my exact private words about my father, to illustrate a point about how I was failing to perform my sadness correctly for her. She had framed it as a healing journey for her followers, a way to discuss toxic stoicism. I scrolled through the comments. "He sounds so cold," one user wrote. "You're so brave for staying with someone so emotionally unavailable during a time like this," wrote another. "The glasses bit is heartbreaking. How can he not see that?" I felt a strange, quiet sensation in my chest. It wasn't a pang of hurt. It was the feeling of a gear shifting into place. For years, I had been the editor. I was the one who trimmed the fat, who fixed the logic, who made sure the narrative held together. I had spent my life making other people look better on paper. Tessa thought she was the author of this story. She thought I was a character she could write and rewrite at her whim, a prop in the theater of her own ego. She saw my silence as a void, a space she could fill with whatever version of me she needed to sell that day. I put the phone in the cup holder and started the engine. The car hummed with a precision that I found comforting. I didn't drive to the park or to a bar. I drove to the office I kept a few miles away. As I drove, I began to categorize. I had the lease to the apartment, which was in my name. I had the shared cloud account, which she had never bothered to secure because she assumed I wouldn't check. I had the logs of every message, every private confidence she had ever betrayed, and every time she had used my life as raw material without my consent. She thought she was playing a game of social leverage. She didn't realize that leverage only works if the other person is trying to stay on the pedestal. I pulled into the parking lot of my office building. The windows were dark, reflecting the orange glow of the streetlights. I sat in the stillness of the car and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked the same pale eyes, the same unassuming jawline. I looked like the man who would let you quote his private pain for likes and simply say, "I see." But as I reached for my laptop bag, I realized that the man who had written those texts, the man who had felt like a ghost in a house of shadows, was gone. He had been crowded out by the noise of her ambition. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed, a bright, sterile white in the darkness of the cabin. I didn't start writing a rebuttal. I didn't post a comment defending myself. That would be loud. That would be expected. Instead, I began to build a folder. I labeled it with her name. Inside, I started to compile the reality she had forgotten existed outside of her phone. I tracked the forwarded messages she'd sent to her inner circle about her client's private data. I found the screenshots of her mocking the very brands she claimed to represent. I found the history of a woman who believed that because she controlled the narrative, she controlled the truth. I wasn't angry. Anger is a fire that burns itself out. This was different. This was cold. This was the realization that the people I had surrounded myself with, the partner who exploited me, the friends who liked her posts, the relatives who whispered behind their hands, they all shared a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was. They thought my restraint was weakness. They thought my silence was an invitation. I leaned back in the seat, the blue light of the screen illuminating the interior of the car. The cliffhanger wasn't what I was going to do to her. The cliffhanger was that she was currently at the house, probably filming a story about the empty chair I had left behind, completely unaware that the man who owned the chair had just stopped being a character in her play. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was 8:14 p.m. I began to type, not a story, but a list of every bridge she had built and exactly how much weight each one could take before it snapped. By the time I finished the first page, I realized something important. This wasn't just about Tessa. This was about everyone who had mistaken my quiet for an absence. I had spent my life being the editor. It was time to become the protagonist. And a good protagonist always ensures the ending is earned. The glow of the laptop was the only thing anchoring me to the physical world as the clock on the dashboard ticked toward midnight. I sat in the parking lot of my office, the silent architecture of the commercial park looming around me like the ribs of a giant, sleeping animal. I had always liked this time of night. It was the only time when the world wasn't trying to sell itself to you, when the constant hum of performative productivity finally dipped into a low, honest frequency. But tonight, the honesty was coming from the screen. I spent the first hour mapping the spread. It was a digital forensics exercise, one that required the kind of detached precision I usually reserved for correcting a messy manuscript. Tessa's post had migrated. It wasn't just on her main profile anymore. It had been shared, screenshotted, and dissected across 3 different platforms. I watched the numbers climb. 5,000 likes, 6,000. The comments were a cascading waterfall of misplaced empathy for her and casual judgment of me. What struck me wasn't the cruelty. Cruelty is common. It was the strategic nature of it. Tessa wasn't just venting, she was branding. She had tagged several high-profile wellness accounts, positioning our private grief as a case study for her upcoming seminar on emotional intelligence. She was using the passing of my father as a ladder. I opened a secondary browser window and logged into our shared cloud drive. It was a space we had set up 2 years ago for vacation photos and tax documents. Tessa, in her arrogance, had never changed the password or considered that the backups from her phone were syncing to a folder I had access to. She viewed me as a utility, like a water heater or a Wi-Fi router, something that hums along in the background, providing a service without ever needing to be questioned. I began to scroll through the Sent folder of her messaging app, which had synced earlier that evening. My hands were steady. There was no shaking, no heat in my face. I felt a profound sense of clarity, the kind you get when you finally see the structural flaw in a building that has been groaning for years. 3 weeks ago, 2 months ago, a year. The betrayal wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment, it was a lifestyle. I found a thread with her sister from last Christmas. While I had been in the kitchen helping her mother with the roast, Tessa had been snapping photos of my father's old-fashioned sweater, mocking his clinging to a forgotten era for the amusement of her group chat. I found messages to an ex-boyfriend, a man she told me was unstable and blocked, where she shared my salary details and lamented that I was too safe, but useful for the transition period. I clicked on a message sent just 4 hours ago while we were still at the wake. It was sent to a contact named Martin PR. "The morning angle is hitting hard," she had written. "Finn is being the perfect stoic prop. I can get at least 3 more weeks of content out of this supporting a grieving partner arc. It's perfect for the autumn launch." I closed the laptop slowly. The sound of the hinge clicking shut was loud in the small space of the car. I didn't feel hurt. Hurt implies surprise. What I felt was the satisfaction of a math problem finally resolving itself. All the little inconsistencies of the last few years, the way she would subtly tilt her phone away, the way she would prompt me to talk about my feelings only to look bored when I did, they all clicked into a straight, logical line. I drove back to our apartment. The streets were empty, the traffic lights blinking yellow at intersections that didn't need them. I pulled into our designated spot and sat for a moment, looking up at the 3rd-floor window. The light was on. She was waiting for me, likely with a rehearsed expression of concern and a glass of wine, ready to film a real talk segment about the difficulty of coming home to a quiet house. I took the stairs instead of the elevator. I wanted to feel the weight of each step. When I opened the door, the scent of expensive candles hit me. Tessa was on the sofa, draped in a cream-colored throw that she only used when she was recording. Her phone was propped up on a tripod on the coffee table, the ring light casting a halo in her eyes. "Finn," she said, her voice dropping into that soft, melodic register she used for her subscribers. "I was so worried. You just disappeared." She reached for the phone, her thumb hovering over the stop button. She had been recording when I walked in. "I didn't disappear," I said, walking into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. "I went to the office. I had some things to finalize." She stood up, the throw sliding off her shoulders with practiced grace. She followed me into the kitchen, her expression shifting from concerned partner to mildly annoyed manager. "The office? Now? Finn, people are asking about you. I've had to handle so many messages. It's exhausting being the one who has to hold the space for everyone." I turned to look at her. In the harsh light of the kitchen, her makeup looked like a mask, the edges of her foundation visible near her hairline. She looked like a stranger I had accidentally invited into my life. "The space is fine, Tessa. You don't need to hold it anymore." She frowned, her eyes narrowing. "What is that supposed to mean? I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to make sure your father's legacy isn't just forgotten in this small-town vacuum." "My father's legacy is in his work, and his son's," I said. "It's not in a wellness arc on your profile. I've seen the post, I've seen the comments." Tessa didn't flinch. She didn't offer a frantic apology or try to explain it away as a misunderstanding. Instead, she straightened her posture, a cold, professional steel entering her gaze. "It's called engagement, Finn. I'm a strategist. I take raw data, life, and I turn it into something that resonates. You should be thanked that I can make your drab little life interesting to people who actually matter." "I'm not data," I said quietly. "In this world, everyone is data," she snapped. "You're just upset because you can't control the narrative. You want to stay in your little bubble where you're the smart, quiet editor and I'm the pretty accessory. Well, the accessory has a platform, and that platform is what pays for this apartment." I set the water glass down on the granite counter. It made a sharp, percussive sound. "The apartment is in my name, Tessa. The lease, the utilities, the insurance, all of it." She laughed, a short, sharp sound. "And? You think you can just, what? Evict me? In the middle of this? Do you know what that would do to your reputation?" Grieving son kicks out supportive partner hours after wake. I'll have the video up before you can even find a cardboard box. You'll be a pariah before breakfast. I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt a genuine sense of pity. Not for her, but for the version of me that had thought she was capable of something beyond transaction. "I'm not going to evict you tonight," I said, "but I am going to change the Wi-Fi password and the cloud credentials, and I've already contacted the landlord to remove my name from the joint renewal for next month. You have 30 days to find a way to pay the full rent on a strategist's salary without my drab income to subsidize it." Her face paled, the mask finally slipping. "You wouldn't. You're too terrified of conflict." "I'm not conflicted at all," I replied. "I'm an editor, Tessa. I'm just cutting the parts of the story that don't work anymore." I walked past her into the bedroom. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't need to. I took my passport, my birth certificate, and the small wooden box my father had kept his watch in. I walked back to the front door. "Finn, get back here," she shouted, her voice losing its melodic quality. It was shrill now, desperate. "You can't just leave. We have a partnership." "No," I said, my hand on the doorknob. "You have a channel. I have a life. There's a difference." I stepped out into the hallway and closed the door behind me. I could hear her muffled shouting through the wood, followed by the sound of something, likely a vase, shattering against the floor. I walked to the elevator, my heart rate steady, my mind already moving to the next phase. As I reached the lobby, my phone vibrated. I expected a frantic text from her, or perhaps a notification of a new vitriolic post. Instead, it was an email from a name I recognized from my father's old address book. It was our cousin, Martin, not the PR man she had messaged, but a different Martin, a silent partner in the local law firm. The subject line was simple. "I saw the post. We need to talk about the house." I stopped in the middle of the lobby. I realized then that Tessa wasn't the only one who had been watching. She wasn't the only one who had been using the situation to calculate their next move. My father's estate was modest, but the land it sat on was valuable for the new highway expansion. I opened the email. It contained a forwarded message from 6 months ago. It was from Tessa, sent to Martin, discussing the eventual liquidation of the family property and asking about the legalities of a partner claiming emotional labor as a basis for a stake in an inheritance. She hadn't just been planning a social media campaign, she had been scouting the territory for a takeover, and she wasn't working alone. I walked out into the cool night air, the realization settling into my bones like a frost. The betrayal wasn't a single thread. It was a web. My partner, my cousin, and God knows who else had been sitting at that wake, looking at the casket and seeing nothing but a balance sheet. I got back into my car and looked at the building one last time. The light in our apartment was flickering, probably from the glow of her filming another update. She thought she was winning because she was loud. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward my brother Rowan's house. He didn't know yet. He still believed in the sanctity of the ritual. He still believed that people were essentially good, if a bit flawed. I was going to have to be the one to tell him that our family home was being measured for curtains by a woman who didn't even know our father's middle name. As I drove, I realized I was no longer interested in just setting boundaries. Boundaries are for people who want to coexist. I was interested in something much more permanent. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive. It contained the work I had done over the last 2 years, the back-end access codes for the local social media aggregate she used, and the logs of every private message she had ever deleted. I wasn't just going to leave the story. I was going to rewrite the ending so thoroughly that no one would ever be able to read the original version again. I pulled into Rowan's driveway. His porch light was on, a lone beacon in the darkness. I saw his shadow through the curtains, pacing back and forth. He was probably praying. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark. My phone buzzed again. A new post from Tessa. Sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who leave us when things get real. Healing. Truth. New beginnings. I looked at the screen, and for the first time that night, I smiled. It was a small, thin smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You have no idea how real it's about to get, Tessa," I whispered to the empty car. I stepped out of the car and headed toward the house. I could see a second car parked further down the street, one I didn't recognize. A dark sedan with its lights off. Someone was watching the house. Someone who wasn't Tessa. The web was larger than I thought, and I was the only one who knew where all the vibrations were coming from. The gravel in Rowan's driveway crunched under my shoes with a rhythmic, grinding sound that felt like teeth on bone. I stood for a moment by the porch, watching the dark sedan parked 50 yards down the street. It was a nondescript vehicle, the kind designed to vanish into the periphery of suburban life. No one sits in a car with the engine off and the lights extinguished at 1 a.m. unless they are waiting for a signal or monitoring a target. I didn't feel the surge of adrenaline I expected. Instead, I felt a deepening of that cold, analytical clarity. I was no longer just a grieving son. I was a piece on a board, and for the first time, I could see the hands trying to move me. I knocked on the door. Rowan opened it almost instantly. He looked haggard, his shirt rumpled, and his hair standing up in uneven tufts. He didn't ask why I was there. He simply stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled of lavender and old paper, a comforting, stagnant scent that felt like a fortress against the digital chaos Tessa was currently broadcasting to the world. "I saw the email from Martin," Rowan said, his voice sandpaper dry. He led me into the kitchen, where a single yellow light over the stove hummed with a low-frequency buzz. "Finn, tell me he's joking. Tell me he didn't actually suggest we sell the house to a developer while our father's things are still sitting in the hall." "He isn't joking, Rowan, and he isn't working alone." I pulled out my phone and laid it on the laminate tabletop. I showed him the message from Tessa to Martin. I watched his eyes track the words, watched the way his jaw tightened until the muscles stood out in sharp relief. "She was asking about legal leverage," Rowan whispered. "While she was sitting at our dinner table? While she was holding your hand?" "She doesn't see hands, Rowan. She sees assets. To her, this house isn't our childhood. It's a capital gains opportunity. And Martin is her architect." Rowan sat down heavily in a wooden chair. "I'm a counselor, Finn. I spend my days helping people find their better angels. I thought I knew how to read people. I let her into our lives. I defended her when she was direct because I thought she was honest. But this is predatory." "It's strategic," I corrected him. "And it's only the beginning. There's a car outside watching us. Someone is making sure we don't do anything to disrupt the liquidation they've already planned. They want us reactive. They want us loud and angry so they can point to our instability as a reason to take control of the estate." I stood up and paced the small kitchen. "But I'm done being reactive. From this moment on, we stop explaining ourselves. We stop answering her texts. We stop trying to convince Martin to be a decent human being. We change the rules of the engagement." The next morning, the sun rose with a pale, indifferent light. I didn't sleep. I spent the hours in Rowan's guest room, using his high-speed connection to finalize the first phase of the correction. I drafted a formal legal notice, not a lawsuit, but a notification of revocation of implied consent. I sent it to Tessa, Martin, and the two friends who had been the most vocal in her comments sections. It was a dry, technical document that stated any further use of my private communications, likeness, or personal data for commercial or promotional gain would be met with an immediate filing for an injunction. I didn't use emotional language. I didn't mention the betrayal. I used the language of a machine. By 10 a.m., my phone was a vibrating brick of desperation. Tessa called 6 times, then she moved to text. "Finn, this is ridiculous. A legal notice? Are you trying to ruin my career over a misunderstanding? Let's talk like adults." I didn't reply. I blocked the number. Then came Martin. "Finn, buddy, I think you're overreacting to an exploratory conversation. I was just trying to protect your interests. Let's grab coffee at the shop on 4th and straighten this out." I didn't go to coffee. Instead, I drove to the parking structure of the office building where Martin had his firm. I knew his routine. He liked the premium spots on the 3rd level, near the elevator. I arrived 20 minutes before his usual start time and waited. When his silver SUV pulled into the bay, I stepped out of my car. I didn't approach him with a scowl. I walked toward him with the same calm, measured gait I used when I was delivering a finished manuscript. Martin saw me and tried to muster a grin, though it didn't quite reach his eyes, which were darting toward the security cameras. "Finn, look, I got your email. Very formal. A bit much for family, don't you think?" He reached out to put a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of patronizing warmth. I stepped back, just enough to make the miss obvious. "The formality is for your benefit, Martin. It creates a clear record of when the professional relationship ended." His grin faltered. "Professional relationship? I'm your cousin, Finn. I'm trying to help you navigate the estate. It's a mess, and you're clearly not in the right headspace to handle it." "I've never been clearer," I said. I leaned against the concrete pillar, my voice echoing slightly in the hollow space of the garage. "I know about the agreement you drafted for Tessa. I know about the emotional labor claim. And I know about the kickback the developer promised you for a quick sale." Martin paled. He looked around the empty garage. "You don't know what you're talking about. That's conjecture. It's hearsay." "It's a digital trail, Martin. And as an editor, I'm very good at finding the subtext. You've been using your firm's server to host the correspondence. That was a mistake. Your partners might find it interesting that you're using company resources to facilitate a private land grab against your own family." "Are you threatening me?" he hissed, his voice dropping an octave. "I'm informing you," I said. "I've already moved my father's files to a private vault. You no longer have access to the power of attorney. If you or Tessa mention the house again, or if that car continues to follow me, the internal audit at your firm starts at noon. I don't need to shout to make that happen. I just need to click send." I watched the sweat break out on his forehead. It was a fascinating physical response, the body betraying the mind's attempt at composure. He wanted to lash out, to call me names, to exert the dominance he thought he held over quiet little Finn, but he couldn't. He was trapped in the very logic he had used to try and trap me. "You're being a monster about this," he muttered, fumbling for his keys. "If being precise makes me a monster, then I accept the title," I replied. "Now get in your car and go to work, and tell your friends to stay off my street. The next time I see that sedan, I won't be talking to you." I walked away without looking back. I felt a strange, humming vibration in my chest, not of fear, but of a quiet, terrifying power. I was no longer playing their game, I was building a new one. Later that afternoon, I met a former colleague at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Elias was a researcher, a man who dealt in deep web archives and data verification. He was the unexpected ally I had kept in my back pocket for years, a man who owed me a significant favor from a project that had nearly cost him his reputation. "You look different, Finn," Elias said, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "Drier, more compressed." "Grief does that," I said, opening the envelope. Inside were several pages of printed data, logins, IP addresses, and a map of social media connections. "I did what you asked," Elias whispered. "I traced the engagement on Tessa's recent posts. It's not organic. About 60% of the comments and shares are coming from a reputation farm out of Eastern Europe. She's paying for the outrage, Finn. She's using her savings to buy the appearance of a movement against you." I looked at the data. It was all there, the timestamps, the bulk purchases of likes, the scripted comments that were being recycled across her different platforms. She wasn't just a scavenger. She was a fraud. She was manufacturing the social pressure she was using to try and break me. "There's more," Elias said, leaning in closer. I looked into the person who tipped her off about the highway expansion value. It wasn't just Martin. There's a third party, someone who's been feeding her information for months, someone inside your own circle. I felt the shift in the air again. Who? Elias pointed to a name on the list. It was an old friend, someone I had known since high school, someone who had been at the wake, nodding sympathetically while I sat in silence. The map was complete now. The betrayal wasn't just a girlfriend and a cousin. It was a coordinated effort by people I had trusted to dismantle my life for a share of a suburban lot. They saw me as an obstacle to be cleared, a weak man who would fold under the weight of public shame and family pressure. Do you want me to leak this? Elias asked, gesturing to the data. It would end her career in an hour. No, I said, sliding the envelope into my bag. A leak is a mess. I want an extraction. I want them to realize they've lost before they even see the move. I left the coffee shop and drove to a small storage unit I had rented under a different name. Inside were the physical remains of my life with Tessa, the few things I hadn't left at the apartment. I sat on a plastic crate and looked at a photo of us from 2 years ago. We were on a beach, smiling, the sun catching the highlights in her hair. Even then, she had been looking at the camera, not at me. I took a lighter from my pocket. I didn't burn the photo. That would be a metaphor, and I didn't have time for metaphors. I simply placed it face down on the cold concrete floor. I reached for my phone and sent a single, encrypted message to the Martin PR contact I had found earlier. I didn't pretend to be Tessa. I didn't pretend to be an angry boyfriend. I sent him a screenshot of the reputation farm data and a copy of the legal notice I had served Martin. The narrative is compromised, I wrote. Withdraw the expansion proposal for the Harlow property by tomorrow morning, or the audit into the inorganic engagement starts with your biggest clients. I'm the one who edits the truth now. I turned off the phone. The silence in the storage unit was absolute. I realized then that I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer seeking justice. I was seeking a total, systemic collapse of their control. I was becoming the person they had feared I was, the one who doesn't shout because he doesn't have to. I walked out and locked the unit. The dark sedan was no longer on the street when I returned to Rowan's. The space was empty, the curb quiet. I went inside and found Rowan in the living room, staring at the wall. They're gone, Finn, he said. The car, the messages, it all just stopped. It hasn't stopped, Rowan, I said, walking toward the kitchen to start a fresh pot of coffee. It's just getting quiet. And in the quiet, you can hear exactly where the cracks are. I knew what came next. I had the map, I had the leverage, and I had the silence. All that was left was to decide which piece to remove first. The storage unit was a metal box of frozen time, smelling of industrial grease and the dust of things forgotten. I sat on a stack of plastic bins, my laptop balanced on my knees, the screen illuminating the map I had built. It wasn't a physical map, but a network of dependencies, the invisible strings that held Tessa, Martin, and my former friend Julian in their respective orbits. People like them operate on a foundation of perceived invulnerability. They believe that because they are the loudest voices in the room, they own the air. They forget that the air is a medium, and mediums can be manipulated. I spent the first few hours of the morning looking into Julian. He had been my closest friend since we were 12. He was the one who had introduced me to Tessa, a fact that now felt less like a coincidence and more like a long-term investment. Julian worked in high-end real estate, specifically focusing on the acquisition of distressed properties. I found the connection in a series of property tax records and shell company filings. Julian was the bridge between the developer and Martin's law firm. He was the one who had identified my father's house as the primary obstacle to a multi-million-dollar bypass project. They weren't just betraying a friendship, they were executing a business plan. I felt a strange, cold hum of satisfaction as I began the dismantling. It wasn't about revenge in the cinematic sense. No shouting matches, no physical altercations. It was about removal. I was going to remove the supports from under their feet and watch how they reacted to the gravity they thought they had outrun. My first stop was a local high-end gym, the kind where the membership fee is a barrier to entry for anyone who doesn't consider their body a brand. Julian was there every morning at 7:30 a.m. I didn't go inside. I stood by his car, a pristine silver German sedan that represented his entire identity. I didn't key the paint. I didn't slash the tires. That was the work of an amateur, a person blinded by heat. Instead, I used the spare key I still had on my ring from the time I watched his dog last summer. I opened the door, sat in the driver's seat, and placed a very specific set of documents on the passenger seat. They were the internal memos from the developer, the ones Elias had helped me recover, which detailed how Julian was being cut out of the final commission in favor of Martin's firm. I didn't leave a note. I simply adjusted the rearview mirror so it was pointed directly at the documents. Then I locked the car and walked away. The beauty of a conspiracy is its fragility. It is built on mutual greed, which is the most unstable element in the human psyche. By showing Julian that his partners were already moving to exclude him, I wasn't just giving him information, I was planting a seed of systemic rot. I knew exactly what he would do. He would call Martin, he would scream, he would demand a meeting, and in doing so, he would break the silence that was their only protection. By noon, I was back in my car, parked across the street from the boutique agency where Tessa worked. She was coming out for lunch, her phone held in front of her face like a shield. She looked tense. Her movements were jerky, lacking the smooth, curated flow of the previous day. The legal notice I had sent was working. It was a pebble in her shoe, a constant reminder that the narrative was no longer hers to control. I waited until she reached the sidewalk, then I rolled down my window. "Tessa," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the ambient noise of the street. She jumped, her phone nearly slipping from her hand. She looked at me, and for a split second, I saw raw, unedited fear in her eyes. It was the look of a person who realizes the prop they've been kicking is actually a weight-bearing wall. "Finn," she stammered, trying to regain her composure. She glanced around to see if anyone was watching. "You shouldn't be here. Your lawyer, the letter said you couldn't use my data for profit," I said, leaning my arm on the window frame. "It didn't say I couldn't say hello? You look tired, Tessa. The engagement must be dropping." "I don't know what you're talking about," she hissed, stepping closer to the car so her voice wouldn't carry. "You think you're so smart with your little legal threats. But I have people, Finn. I have a following. I can make you look like a monster in 10 minutes. "You already tried that," I replied. "But here's the problem with a following built on fiction. It requires constant maintenance. And you're about to be very busy with other things." I held up a folder. It was a printout of her agency's Code of Ethics, specifically the section regarding the use of client data for personal gain. Tucked behind it was a screenshot of her message to Martin about the liquidation. The agency doesn't know you're using their proprietary research tools to scout private family land, does it? They tend to be very sensitive about their employees using company time to facilitate private real estate scams. Tessa's face went a shade of gray that no filter could fix. "You wouldn't send that. You'd be hurting yourself. If I lose my job, I can't pay my share of the rent." "I don't live there anymore, Tessa. I don't care about the rent. I care about the truth." I put the folder back on the seat. "I'm giving you an hour. That's 60 minutes to delete every post that mentions my family, my father, or me. After that, this folder goes to your boss. And Martin's partners get a very similar one." "You're a villain," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're actually a villain." "No," I said, shifting the car into gear. "I'm just the editor, and this chapter is far too long. Cut it, or I will." I drove away before she could respond. In the rearview mirror, I saw her standing on the sidewalk, her phone forgotten at her side. She looked small. For the first time, she wasn't a strategist or a visionary. She was just a woman standing in the sun, realizing the world was much larger and much colder than the screen in her pocket. The afternoon was a blur of calculated movements. I visited the bank. I visited the county records office. I met with a surveyor who had worked with my father for 20 years. Step by step, I began to wall off the estate. I didn't just protect the house. I used a series of obscure zoning laws and historical preservation markers to render the land useless for a highway expansion. My father had been a quiet man, but he had kept impeccable records. He had known the land was valuable, and he had already done half the work to protect it decades ago. I was just finishing the sentences he had started. As evening approached, the social fallout began. Julian had clearly made his call to Martin. My phone, the secondary one I was using to monitor their channels, lit up with reports of a public disturbance at a high-end restaurant downtown. Martin and Julian had been seen arguing loudly on the patio. Someone had recorded it. In the video, Julian was shouting about loyalty and the commission, while Martin was trying to hush him, looking around in a panic. It was perfect. They were doing the work for me. They were exposing their own greed in the most public way possible, providing the very outrage that Tessa usually manufactured. I returned to Rowan's house just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The sky was a bruised purple, the light fading into a deep, heavy shadow. Rowan was sitting on the porch, a glass of iced tea in his hand. He looked more peaceful than he had in days. "They're turning on each other, Finn," he said, holding up his own phone. "I've had 3 cousins call me in the last hour. They're asking what's going on with Martin. Apparently he's been asked to take a leave from the firm until the internal audit is complete." "It's a start," I said, sitting on the top step. "Is this what you wanted?" Rowan asked. He looked at me, and there was a touch of wariness in his expression. "To watch them fall apart?" I wanted them to stop, I said. This is just the method that worked. You're different, Rowan noted. There's a hardness in you. It's like you've turned off the part of yourself that feels the weight of it. The weight is still there, Rowan. I've just learned how to balance the load. My phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. I opened it. It was a photo of my father's headstone taken from a distance. The caption was a single word: soon. I felt a tightening in my chest, a sudden, sharp focus. It wasn't Tessa or Martin. This was something else. This was the third party Elias had mentioned, the one who had been feeding them information from the inside. I stood up, the peace of the moment evaporating. I looked down the street. The dark sedan was back. It wasn't 50 yards away this time. It was parked right in front of the house, its engine idling with a low, predatory growl. The driver's side window rolled down a few inches. I couldn't see the face, only the silhouette of someone watching us. Finn? Rowan asked, standing up. What is it? Go inside, Rowan. Lock the doors. What's going on? The game just changed, I said. I didn't go inside. I walked down the porch steps and toward the sidewalk. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I walked with the steady, unwavering purpose of a man who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The sedan didn't move. It waited for me to reach the edge of the lawn. I realized then that Tessa and Martin were just the distractions. They were the noisy, clumsy tools used by someone much more capable, someone who knew my family's secrets better than I did, someone who had been waiting for my father to be gone so they could step out of the shadows. As I reached the curb, the car door opened. A man stepped out. He was older, dressed in a sharp, expensive suit that looked out of place in our suburban neighborhood. He looked at me with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. "You've been very busy, Finn," he said. His voice was cultured, smooth, and entirely devoid of warmth. "You've done a remarkable job of cleaning up the mess your friends made, but you've made one very large mistake." "And what's that?" I asked. "You think this is about a highway," he said, stepping into the light of the street lamp. I recognized him then. He was the man from the back of the wake, the one I had thought was a distant relative, the one who had spent the whole afternoon observing the room. "The highway is a convenience. This is about the legacy your father buried 40 years ago. And you're the only one left who can dig it up." He smiled, and it was the most unsettling thing I had ever seen. Tessa was a useful fool. Martin was a greedy one. But now that the noise is gone, we can finally talk about the real story. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key, an old, heavy brass key that I recognized instantly. It was the key to my father's private study at the house, the one I had been unable to find since the day he passed. "I have the map, Finn," he said. "The real map. And I think it's time you showed me where the last chapter ends." The cliffhanger wasn't that I was being hunted. The cliffhanger was that I realized I wasn't the protagonist of this story yet. I was still just the editor, and the real author had finally arrived to claim the draft. The brass key in the man's hand caught the pale glow of the street lamp, a solid, heavy weight against the darkness. I looked at it, then back at the man who called himself a relative but stood there like a predator. His name, I remembered now, was Arthur Vane. He had been my father's business partner decades ago, before a silent, permanent falling out that was never discussed at the dinner table. To see him here, holding the key to my father's most private sanctuary, felt like watching a ghost reach out to adjust the furniture. "You shouldn't have come here, Arthur," I said. My voice was a flat line, a monotone that betrayed nothing of the gears turning behind my eyes. I was no longer looking at the chess pieces I had already knocked over. Tessa, Martin, Julian, they were the static on the screen. Arthur was the signal. "I had to wait for the noise to subside, Finn," Arthur replied, his voice a polished rasp. "Your little drama with the strategist and the lawyer was quite the spectacle. Very efficient work on your part. You have your father's knack for seeing the structural weakness in others. But you're playing for pennies when there's a treasury under your feet." He gestured toward the sedan. "Get in. We're going to the house. We're going to open the study, and we're going to finish this. Or you can stay here on the curb and wait for the consequences of your efficiency to catch up with you. I imagine Martin's firm is already looking for someone to blame for that internal audit. I could easily provide them with a narrative that points directly at you." I didn't hesitate. I walked around the car and got into the passenger seat. Rowan was still standing on the porch, his face a pale blur in the shadows. I didn't look back at him. I couldn't afford the distraction of his concern. The drive to my father's house was short and silent. Arthur drove with a mechanical precision, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I watched the familiar neighborhood slide by, the houses looking like cardboard cutouts under the moonlight. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked different, looming and secretive. The lilies from the wake had been removed, but the scent still seemed to linger in the bricks. Arthur unlocked the front door and led the way. He moved through the foyer as if he had never left, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood. When we reached the door to the study, he paused. He turned the brass key in the lock, and the mechanism clicked with a sound that felt like a sentence being passed. The room was exactly as I remembered it, yet entirely foreign. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with the dense, technical volumes my father had spent his life studying. The desk was clear, save for a green-shaded lamp and a silver letter opener. He was a meticulous man, Arthur said, walking to the far wall where a map of the county was pinned. But he was a man of secrets. He found something out in the valley 40 years ago, something the highway department is very interested in keeping hidden. It's not about the land value, Finn. It's about the soil. It's about what's buried beneath it that shouldn't be disturbed. He turned to look at me, his eyes gleaming with a feverish intensity. The expansion isn't just a road, it's an excavation. And your father had the only records that prove the environmental catastrophe that would follow if they break ground. Those records are worth more than the land itself. They're worth the silence of the state. I stood by the desk, my hand resting on the cool surface of the mahogany. I realized then that Tessa and the others were just the surface ripples. They were the useful fools Arthur had manipulated to pressure me into a corner. He wanted the records. He wanted the leverage that my father had held over the expansion project for years. "You're not here to protect the environment, Arthur," I said. "You're here to sell the silence." "I'm here to collect a debt," he corrected. "Your father took my share of the partnership and turned it into a moral crusade. I'm just here to rebalance the ledger." I looked at the map on the wall. I saw the markings my father had made, small, precise circles in the valley. I remembered him taking me out there when I was a boy, telling me that some things are meant to stay under the earth. I had thought he was talking about fossils. I realize now he was talking about accountability. "The records aren't here," I said. Arthur's face hardened. "Don't lie to me, Finn. I know his systems. He kept everything in this room." "He did," I said, moving behind the desk. "Until he didn't. He knew you'd come back eventually. He knew that greed like yours doesn't just dissipate, it waits." I reached into the top drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It wasn't the records. It was a logbook. "He spent the last 6 months of his life digitizing everything," I said, holding up the book. "Every soil sample, every survey, every correspondence with the department. It's all in a secure, encrypted vault, and the only way to access it is through a multi-factor authentication system that requires my presence and Rowan's." Arthur stepped toward me, his composure finally beginning to crack. "You think you can hold me off with a password? I have resources, Finn. I have people who make a living out of opening doors that are supposed to be locked." "Maybe," I said, "but you don't have time. While we were driving here, I triggered a scheduled release. If I don't check in within the next hour, a summary of those records goes to the regional news and the Environmental Protection Agency. It's an automatic fail-safe, Arthur. My father was very fond of them." The silence in the room became heavy, pressing against the walls. Arthur stared at me, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He realized he had walked into the very trap he thought he had set for me. He had underestimated the editor. He had assumed I was a character in his story when I had already rewritten the script. "You're bluffing," he whispered. "Am I? You saw what I did to Tessa and Martin. I don't bluff, Arthur. I just prepare. I've spent my life making sure the narrative is consistent. And the consistent part of this story is that people like you always assume the quiet person is the one with nothing to say." I walked toward the door, my movements calm and deliberate. "Now, here is what's going to happen. You're going to leave this house. You're going to leave this town. And you're going to ensure that the highway expansion is canceled. Not because of the records, but because you're going to tell your resources that the land is toxic in a way that will ruin them if they touch it. And if I don't, then the records go public. And your name is all over the original partnership documents that authorized the initial dumping 40 years ago. You're not just a collector, Arthur. You're a conspirator. And unlike my father, I have no interest in protecting your reputation." Arthur looked at the notebook in my hand, then at the door. He saw the finality in my expression, the absolute lack of hesitation. He saw that I had accepted the role he had tried to thrust upon me. I was the villain of his story, and I was perfectly comfortable with that. He turned without a word and walked out of the study. I heard the front door close, then the sound of the sedan's engine igniting and fading into the distance. I stood in the center of the room, the green lamp casting a long shadow across the floor. I felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but also a strange, hollow peace. The house was quiet again. The threats were gone. The web had been dismantled. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had memorized years ago. "It's done," I said when the voice on the other end answered. Did he take the bait? Elias asked. He took the exit. He's too afraid of his own history to stay. The expansion will be over by Monday. And the records? They stay in the vault, I said, looking at the map on the wall. Some things are meant to stay under the earth. I hung up the phone and sat in my father's chair. I looked at the silver letter opener on the desk. I thought about Tessa, probably still staring at her phone in a darkened apartment, wondering how she had lost control of her own reality. I thought about Martin, whose career was currently being dismantled by the very precision he had tried to exploit. I wasn't a hero. I hadn't saved anything that wasn't already mine. I had simply enforced a set of consequences on people who believed they were exempt from them. Rowan walked into the room then. He looked at me, then at the empty space where Arthur had stood. Is it over? He asked. It's over, I said. What did he want? He wanted the past, I replied. But the past doesn't belong to him anymore. It belongs to us, and we're going to keep it quiet. Rowan nodded slowly. He didn't ask for details. He knew me well enough to know that the details were the parts I had already edited out. He saw the notebook on the desk and reached out to touch the leather. Father would have been proud of you, Finn, he said. You have his spine. I have his records, Rowan. That's enough. I stood up and walked to the window. The moon was high now, casting a silver light over the valley. It looked peaceful. It looked like a place where secrets could rest. But as I looked at my own reflection in the glass, I saw the man I had become. I saw the person who could move pieces on a board without feeling the heat of the game. I saw the person who could end a relationship, a career, and a conspiracy with the same detached efficiency. I realized then that the final act of revenge wasn't what I had done to them. It was what they had done to me. They had forced me to see the world through their eyes. And in doing so, they had ensured that I would never be able to look at it any other way again. I was the only one left who knew the whole story, and I was the only one who would ever know how it ended. I reached for the lamp and turned it off. The room plunged into darkness. Let's go home, Rowan, I said. The story was finished. The narrative was closed. All that was left was the silence. The night had reached its thinnest point, that fragile hour before dawn when the world feels more like a blueprint than a reality. I stood on the porch of the family home, watching the last traces of the valley's mist curl around the oak trees. The air was crisp, tasting of ozone and wet grass. Rowan had finally fallen into a restless sleep in the guest room, exhausted by a reality he wasn't built to navigate. I, however, felt a strange, electric wakefulness. My mind was a clean slate, the noise of the past week having been scrubbed away by the sheer force of my own resolve. I checked my phone one last time. There was a single notification from an anonymous server. The expansion project was officially under review. The developer had pulled their bid citing unforeseen geological instability. Arthur Vane had kept his word, likely fleeing back to whatever shadows he called home, terrified of the transparency I had threatened. The systemic threat was neutralized. The house was safe. But there was one final piece of the narrative that required a conclusion. Control is not a static state. It is a choice made every second. I had spent my life as a background character, an observer of other people's louder, messier lives. Today, the observation ended. I walked down the driveway, my footsteps rhythmic and purposeful, and got into my car. I didn't drive to the office or the storage unit. I drove back to the apartment I had shared with Tessa. The building stood silent against the fading stars. I used my physical key, the one I had promised to return but had kept for this specific moment. I moved through the lobby and up the stairs, avoiding the elevator's hum. When I reached the third floor, I paused outside the door. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of a laptop playing a video loop. Tessa's own voice, probably an old recording, echoing in the hollow space. I opened the door quietly. The apartment was a wreckage of curated life. Suitcases were half-packed and abandoned in the hallway. The ring light sat toppled over in the living room, its circular bulb casting a cold, artificial glare across the hardwood. Tessa was sitting on the sofa, her face illuminated by the harsh blue light of her screen. She looked up when I entered, and for a moment the performative mask was entirely absent. There was only the raw, jagged edge of a person whose social currency had been devalued to zero. "You came back," she whispered. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual melodic cadence. "I came for the key," I said. I stood in the center of the room, my coat still on, looking down at the scattered remnants of our life. And to see the result of the edit. Tessa laughed, a brittle, dry sound. "The result? Look at it, Finn. You won. My agency let me go an hour ago. My followers are tearing me apart in the comments because I haven't posted a rebuttal to the leaks about the reputation farm. I'm a ghost on my own platform." You aren't a ghost, Tessa, I said, walking toward the coffee table. You're just finally experiencing the reality of the narrative you built. You treated people as data points. Now, you're the data point that doesn't fit the algorithm. I reached out and picked up her phone. She didn't try to stop me. She just watched with a vacant, hollow stare. I looked at the screen. It was a draft of a new post, a desperate attempt to frame herself as a victim of digital harassment and emotional sabotage. Delete it, I said. Why? It's the only thing I have left. Because it isn't true, and because if you post it, the folder I sent to the agency becomes a public file. I've already scripted the delivery. If that publish button is pressed, the world gets to see the messages you sent to Julian and Martin about the estate. They'll see exactly how much you thought my father's memory was worth in dollars. Tessa's eyes filled with a sudden, sharp clarity. You're not just leaving me, you're erasing me. I'm correcting the record, I said. I placed the phone face down on the table. You wanted to be a storyteller, Tessa. You just forgot that every story has a climax. This is yours. I held out my hand. After a long, agonizing silence, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the spare key. She dropped it into my palm. The metal was warm, a sharp contrast to the coldness of the room. I loved you, Finn, she said, though even now the words felt like they were being tested for impact. No, I said. You loved the version of me that didn't talk back. You loved the silence you could fill with your own voice. That's not love, that's casting. I turned and walked toward the door. As I reached the threshold, I stopped and looked back at the ring light on the floor. I walked over to it and, with a single, calculated motion, I stepped on the bulb. The glass shattered with a soft, musical chime, and the apartment plunged into the honest, gray light of the approaching dawn. The light's better this way, I said. I walked out of the apartment and down the hall. I didn't look back at the door. I didn't wait for her to cry or shout. I knew she wouldn't. She was already reaching for her phone, already trying to find a way to spin the darkness into a new aesthetic. But it wouldn't matter. The infrastructure of her influence was gone, dismantled by the very precision she had mocked. I reached the street just as the sun broke over the horizon. The sky was a brilliant, searing gold, reflecting off the glass of the office buildings downtown. I felt a profound sense of lightness. The weight of the house, the betrayal, and the secrets had been transmuted into something else. A hard, indestructible core of self-reliance. I drove back to the storage unit one last time. I didn't go inside. I simply stood by the metal door and watched the world wake up. I thought about the report I would have to give Rowan, the ways I would have to frame the truth to keep his world intact. I was the editor of his reality now, too. It was a heavy burden, but I found I didn't mind the weight. I took the USB drive from my pocket, the one containing the map, the records, and the evidence of everything that had happened over the last 7 days. I walked to the edge of the parking lot, where a small concrete storm drain disappeared into the earth. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the drive into the dark opening. I heard it click against the metal grate before falling into the silence below. The data was gone. The leverage was gone. All that remained was the knowledge in my head and the peace of the valley. I got back into my car and started the engine. I wasn't going to the house. I wasn't going to work. I was going to drive until the suburbs faded into the distance, until the names and the faces of the people who had tried to break me were nothing more than footnotes in a story I had already finished reading. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was calm. My eyes were clear. I didn't look like a man who had lost everything. I looked like a man who had finally found the beginning. I put the car in gear and pulled onto the highway. The road ahead was open, stretching toward the horizon like a clean white page. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look back. I simply drove.